absolutely. When you feed real food, well, let's go back a fraction. What we're talking about is two very different paradigms. One is a paradigm based on feeding nutrients. The other is a paradigm based on feeding food. Now, when you feed food, it's a totally different thing to selecting out or going through a process where you decide what nutrients are present in food, what nutrients an animal requires, how much it requires, what will happen if it doesn't have the right ones. Now, that is what we have done, and that's the nutritional or the nutritionist's approach to nutrition. The evolutionary nutritionist approach to nutrition is to say, well, yes, they need nutrients, but I will never, by my research, find out which nutrients they need exactly how much they need, etc., etc. This is virtually unknowable in nutrition. Well, we know a lot, but we don't know. And we've got NRC and AFFCO coming up with rules, and I think it's FEDIAF or something in Europe. They come up with rules, but it's all based on supplying nutrients. And the reason they need to supply nutrients is because they want to supply food or a material, it's hardly food, which is based on biologically inappropriate materials. Foods that animal did not evolve to require or evolve eating. Animals evolved eating food. In that food, there are nutrients, and this is what shapes the animal's genome. The form of the food, which is raw and, excuse me, whole, and the form of that food and the fact that it contains, if you feed the broad balance of the food that animal evolved eating, you're going to supply every nutrient it requires and in the form it requires. And this works together with the homeostatic mechanisms of the animal in question, because this is what has been honed between the food and the genome over millions of years of evolution. You cannot duplicate that relationship by simply saying, compiling a list of foods that your science has decided a list of nutrients that science has deemed as necessary, trying to figure out how much of each of those, how they interact with each other. But you can't, because what you do is you put all these together and you mix them together and you cook them. And suddenly you've got masses of chemical interactions and you're producing material that this genome has never come across before. Now, when you feed that way, obtaining balance is on a knife edge. It's very, very critical. Whereas when you feed real food, the balance is broad like a road. It's really very simple. And this is one of the things I say. Nutrition is absurdly simple if you follow evolutionary rules. If you follow the modern nutritionist approach, it's beyond complicated. If you try and understand evolutionary nutrition, it's beyond complicated. It's beyond that raised to the power of infinity, because the cybernetics of the relationship between genes and food and what we currently call nutrigenomics and epigenetics, that is beyond our understanding. There is no computer that can deal with it, and yet it just happens. And it's there, and we can use it, excuse me, without understanding it. I mean, that's a long-winded way of saying we just don't have to understand nutrition. We just have to know the foods that animals are supposed to eat, and in roughly the same proportions.
The thing that comes to mind for me, is that in human foods, every 3 years they decide eggs are either bad for you or good for you, because they're still learning so much, but they apparently have the dog and the cat down. Humans, we're still learning, but dogs and cats, we totally got that. And I don't believe them. I stopped taking advice from Nestle nutritionally many years ago.
Well, the fundamentally most wicked, bad, awful, terrible, destructive thing they do is source of energy.
Carbohydrates.
Because not one of the species that we feed commercially, whether it's humans, dogs or cats, evolved eating this high starch, basically high sugar diet. We did not evolve on that. And the metabolic problems that brings are atrocious. Problem is, we have some very resilient genomes in all three species that do not show problems until later in life. And then they're horrendous problems.
That's where that epigenetics comes in. Your environment affecting your genes.
Well, yes, but the environment of carbohydrates as the major energy source just absolutely destroys us. And and a lot of it is actually through the mitochondria, as we're now discovering.
And is that ultimately the goal of pointing the bone at cancer, is showing that the root of what we're seeing today in 50% of dogs getting cancer, the more dogs die of cancer, and this, I don't know that this is fact, but Rodney Habib has said he's seen the study that says more dogs die of cancer than every other mammal on the planet.
I suspect that's probably true. And the most problematic one is the golden retriever, because of who they used as sire, some show winner some time back who absolutely had a lot of predisposing genes. But the point of pointing the bone at cancer is that our understanding of cancer itself at the moment is profoundly wrong. That's really my point. And that being the case, it explains exactly why we are failing to do anything worthwhile for people with metastatic cancer.
Because it's essentially a nutritional disease.
Absolutely. Well, it's a disease of failing mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
Just very briefly, oh gosh, where do you start with mitochondria?
Well, you gave a lovely history of mitochondria in the book, and yes, and you and there's many other mitochondrial diseases besides cancer, like MS comes to mind.
What they're finding is that all the mitochondrial diseases tend to occur later in life, and they affect the major organs. What is being realized is that those specific mitochondrial diseases, which are due to genetic problems with the mitochondria, are mimicking or showing us the way to all the degenerative diseases, which are actually due to failing mitochondria. Now, in the case of cancer and the other degenerative diseases, actually go in two opposite directions. In a way, it's quite strange. Oh gosh, how do we explain this? In a degenerative disease like kidney failure, the mitochondria in the cells fail for a variety of reasons, but the cells die. And so, as more and more cells within the organ die, it becomes less and less able to perform its functions to the level required by the organisms. And so we get things like kidney failure,
right?
Because of the loss of cells. On the other hand, cancer is a situation where, because the damage is very slow and very chronic, I didn't mention in the degenerative disease, the cells are dying because the mitochondria are being destroyed by the environment, food, mainly by reactive oxygen species, and again produced by high carbohydrate diets. All right, but so in all degenerative diseases, we're getting destruction of mitochondria. In most of the degenerative diseases where you get organ failure, the cell commits suicide.
Right, right, and it's actually programmed to do so. Exactly
right. But in the case of cancer, yes, we get this failing mitochondria, and Warburg showed this back in the late 20s, 30s, and through to the 50s. He showed that if the damage to the mitochondria is slow enough, and the organism, or the cell, and this only happens in tissue stem cells, if the tissue stem cells can gradually turn on an alternative energy supply, and this is all about energy. So in degenerative disease like kidney failure, the loss of energy, the cell dies, commits suicide.